Hello everyone and welcome to our latest series of the retro ups and downs. Way back in the day, we used to have a thing where we were like, what are we gonna do when there's no new Star Trek airing? And yes, we stumbled on the ideas of going back and covering episodes that deserve to be covered. Well, they all deserve to be covered. Going back and taking some of the more notorious ones. Our very first retro ups and downs, for example, was for Sub Rosa, which I will defend to the death is a camp classic, and who doesn't love a nice sex candle? For this series, we're going to do something a little bit differently, and what we're going to do is go through the pilot episodes for all of the Star Treks that we haven't yet covered. We're going to go back and we're going to do the original series right through to Enterprise. We're also going to do Discovery because we only started doing the ups and downs for Discovery from its third season onwards. You might be looking at this and going, Sean, isn't the pilot for the original series The Cage? Or isn't the pilot for the original series Where No Man Has Gone Before? And quite frankly, you're both right. The Man Trap, however, is the very first televised episode of Star Trek in both Canada and the United States. There was a difference of 2 days between them. In Canada, it aired on the 6th of September, 1966, and in the United States, it aired on the 8th of September, 1966. But in both cases, this was the very first episode of Star Trek that was ever shown to audiences outside of an NBC pitching room. Because of course some people had seen The Cage. It was not, of course, the first produced episode of the original series, which is why in the course of this series, we are going to cover Where No Man Has Gone Before, and we're going to cover The Cage as well. But I didn't want to start with them. I want to do those as we go along. There is quite a lot to say about this because, frankly, I mean, it's one of the oldest episodes of Star Trek that has ever been produced, so we've had the most time to learn so much about it. But in going back through this episode, you can see from its earliest days so many of the ingredients for what would go on to inform Star Trek as a series and as a franchise overall that would follow. In fact, watching things like the Kelvin Universe films and Strange New Worlds, you can see so many of the things that informed those two interpretations are here as well. We are going to do what we always go to do. We're going to go through the episode scene by scene, giving everything that we like an up and everything that we didn't like a down. We will then, at the end, go to our special place that is unique to the retro ups and downs. So stick around for temporal observations at the end. But before any of that, let's jump in to all of the ups and downs for Star Trek, the original series, The Man Trap. The first scene that was shown to audiences depicts Spock in the captain's chair, because Kirk you first hear via a captain's log. He is beaming down to the planet M113 with ship's Surgeon McCoy and Ensign Ricky. Okay, not quite Ensign Ricky, it's crewman Darnell. I mean, Ensign Ricky sort of sums up what we're to expect here from this crewman. Some of the things right there in the first episode. One thing to notice, that it's actually quite funny when you go back and watch it now, and you just fully expect Darnell to be wearing a red shirt, don't you? But he's actually wearing blue. So the first random crewman that's killed in Star Trek is actually a blue shirt as opposed to a red shirt. There you are now. That's a good trivia question. You know, he is currently still alive as the episode starts. What I did think was quite funny was that in Captain Kirk's log, he makes a point of including the fact that they're going down to visit the craters, one of whom is McCoy's old flame. I just thought that was an interesting thing to include in your captain's log. They beam down, the scene is set quite well, we get... Now, I should also say that for these reviews, we'll be working from the remastered version of the original series. Frankly, it's the one that's most widely available, so I would imagine a lot of the audience watching this is probably more familiar with the remastered version. If, however, you do possess, I believe it's the Blu-rays, it could be the DVDs as well, I'm actually not 100% sure as I say this, but I think that you can watch either version if you have the physical copies, just another reason as to why physical media is very important to support. But yes, for this, we will be using the remastered editions, and that means then that, you know, some of the wider shots of the planet are quite a bit extended. The planet itself is quite a bit extended. And of course, the Enterprise is... listen, I like a lot of the stuff that was filmed for the original series. My first exposure to the original series was the unremastered editions back in, it was the 90s, I think I was watching them on BBC. You know the bits where you could kind of see the string holding the Enterprise flying across the screen. I'm exaggerating, but they'd showed their age a little bit at that point. I did see some of the unremastered footage, and I was like, is that the Enterprise as it appeared in the cage and where no man has gone before? Now, I don't believe that it is. This episode was actually produced a few episodes along, but the Enterprise looked a little bit different under Pike and under Kirk version 1. The deflector dish was bigger, there was spikes on the front of the Bussard collectors. Both of those had been changed going into the main series. Back down to the planet. They note that it's been 10 years since McCoy has seen Nancy Crater. So when she walks in and looks exactly as he remembers her from 10 years before, the first thing you'd be thinking is, happy days, everybody moved to this planet. It's like the Baku world, it just keeps regenerating you. But then Kirk sees something a little bit different. He sees, as his own words, a handsome woman with a few grey hairs. Oh, the 60s. And Darnell sees a woman he left behind on Wrigley's Pleasure Planet. Oh, the 60s. Nancy seems genuinely delighted to see McCoy, which is really quite interesting when you know what's coming. She does, however, immediately sort of go in and sort of cup his face in her hands. And again, when you know what's coming, I wouldn't let her do that. If I were you, Leonard? Darnell is dismissed outside by Kirk, probably because of the Wrigley's Pleasure Planet comment. It was a bit of a weird one, Darnell, I'm not going to lie to you. Outside he goes, and outside his version of Nancy Crater goes as well. And the two of them need a TV mature audiences label slapped on them for how much they are undressing each other with their eyes. Fun fact. One of the early produced episodes was Mudd's Women, which, hasn't really aged very well. And in fact was rejected as the first episode to air because NBC didn't want to have the first episode of this new series being about buying and selling women. So they went with the much more progressive, let's make her an object of men's eyes. Well, here, it's handled, I think, a lot more, it's a lot cleverer, handled more cleverly, because that becomes one of the things that, quite frankly, sets men up to fail in this episode. Darnell quite quickly falls victim to this succubus, if you like, because he is ruled by, there's a line later on in the episode where Kirk says, stop thinking with your glands. Here, rather than women being treated as objects, the power, if you like, of seduction is used as a weapon. It's a very different way to start the series and its introduction to audiences. I'm going to give overall the introduction to Star Trek, the opening scenes, an up. I think it is a great way to set up who and what we're dealing with. You get really great characterization from Kirk straight away. There's an interesting thing about his log, which I'll mention in a moment. You get a really good introduction to Dr. McCoy as well. He's definitely a little bit gruff, he's a little bit older, but you can see where everyone fits in this version of the crew. And although it is I mean, it was produced in 1966. You know, I'm not going to lie to you, there's still a lot of 60s aesthetic and 60s how things were made on show here. I mean, you could easily look at this as sort of B-movie stuff, which I don't mean in a derogatory way. You know, when I think of B-movie from particularly this era, I think of things like Forbidden Planet, which we know was a massive influence on Gene Roddenberry in creating this series. And you really can see that here. But it also, having done The Cage and having obviously produced other episodes ahead of this, you can see that this show is quite confident. This is a confident first episode to go with. Like, I get why they went with the man trap, which will be interesting when we get to temporal observations. My next up is something that's a little bit unusual for Star Trek, and that is the voiceover of the captain's log. Here, you have a version of Kirk recording the log who is ahead of the version of Kirk we see on the planet. In the captain's log, he says, although we were unaware of it at the time, we were all of us seeing a different version of Nancy Crater. And I had to think, well, that's not something that Star Trek often does. Having a captain's log recorded after the fact, but played during. You more or less sort of have them in time together. So I quite liked that. It also a bit of a tease. You're like, well, Kirk's probably going to survive then. Robert Crater is a prickly fellow. He arrives and he does not want Starfleet there. He doesn't want to be interrogated. He doesn't want anything to be scanned or checked. And well, I think we can all sort of understand why. This is where we get this discussion of Nancy. Roger says something like, you know, I enjoy the solitude, but you know how it is for women. Look, I said I didn't hate how a lot of it was produced. I am still going to give a down, for there's still a whack ton of 60s sexism going on here. The discussion about women as well is not very enlightened and has not aged particularly well. Star Trek does have, I think, a deserved reputation for being progressive. You know, when you judge it by 2025 standards, some things really haven't aged well at all. You only need to think about how the original series ends with the episode Turnabout Intruder. Some things, there's no point in trying to defend them because they're a bit indefensible. But then other things, if you look at them in a contemporary setting, not the discussion of women, sorry, that's not what I'm saying here, but how having Uhura on the bridge, I know it's such a well-worn point at this point, but that was as radical in 1966 as anything Discovery's ever done in the 2020s and beyond. The reason I say that is because sadly it is not surprising that Star Trek did fall victim to an awful lot of sexism in how it presents some of its female characters. It is something I've sort of learned to live with while watching back the original series. It did a lot of good, and it did push the boat a lot. The Cage had #1 as the first officer on the Enterprise. But it's not perfect, and some bits have aged better than others. And it is worth bearing that in mind and having that discussion today. Professor Crater's mood changes entirely once he realizes that the landing party has seen Nancy, and he becomes a little bit more communicative. Kirk then says his thing about, oh, she's a handsome woman, but she has a few grey hairs. And McCoy seems to take that rather personally, because from McCoy's point of view, he has literally seen the woman as he remembers her from a decade prior. Crater tips his hand here. He says that he's sure the next time McCoy sees her, she will look as she is now. And he sort of tries to sort of wave it away, if you like, that, kind of the eyes of youth and the eyes of love. Outside, you get a monumental moment in Star Trek. The first person to die on screen. Can we get a hand for crewman Darnell? All right, well done, mate. Well done, Darnell, you did good. Here, have an up for being the first one to die. Have an up for not dying in a red shirt. That's impressive. But I'm genuinely up for our first, he's dead, Jim. It's funny when you go back and watch it like this, and you're like, some of the big moments are small. It's just not off the cuff, he's dead, Jim. Nancy is certainly acting the part of someone who's very frightened. She says she discovered Darnell having eaten the Borgia plant, which is poisonous, and might be responsible for the mottled appearance of his face. There are red rings all over the crewman's face. Well, as they're going to find out, that's not to do with anything to do with the plant. Talking about tipping hands, Nancy says something about, like, why do you look at me like you don't believe me? Which is something that someone who shouldn't be believed would definitely say. And then follows it by immediately requesting salt. We need salt. Salt is an important commodity on planet M113. We get the only appearance of Scotty in this episode, as it turns out, from archived recordings. When Kirk signals up to the Enterprise that they're beaming back, it's Scotty who answers, but James Doohan doesn't actually appear in the man trap. So there you go, another bit of trivia. James Doohan is not in the first televised episode of Star Trek. His voice is, but it was used from another episode's recording. We then have an exchange on the bridge. This is before Spock and Uhura are aware of what's happened. And Uhura is full-on flirting with Spock. He's opens up by saying, you made an error in your reporting of the frequency. She says, if I hear the word frequency one more time, I might cry. You could tell me I'm, an attractive woman. What's it like to walk lazily on Vulcan under the moon? All of this is quite funny because we know that years later, a romance between Spock and Uhura would be explored in the Kelvin universe. And it's funny to see it's so early here, those ingredients being dropped into Star Trek. For me, it's an up. I really enjoy Leonard Nimoy and Nichelle Nichols together in this scene. It also gives there's a comfort. These people know each other, even though it's sort of like they're presenting it as Uhura's trying to get to know more about Spock. When we get the sort of wider context of shows like Strange New Worlds and you realize they'd actually been serving together for about a decade at this point, it makes it a little bit harder to marry them up. But here there is a breeziness and a comfort, even with Spock being quite emotionless about everything. We also get some important bits of Vulcan lore dropped as well. There is one bit where it goes a little too far, and I am actually going to down it. And that is the sort of exposition dump where Uhura says, Captain Kirk is the closest thing you have to a friend. Little bit personal there. Spock counters with, my expression of emotion will not change the fact that someone has died in the away team. Because at this point they know someone has died, but they don't know exactly who. There is a great scene in the dispensary, which is McCoy being quite stubborn and also confident. He knows that it can't have been the Borgia plant that killed Darnell because there would be signs of alkaloid poisoning. And he snaps at Kirk and he says, Jim, don't tell me my business. There is no sign of poisoning in this body. Oh, not for the fact that they argue, but that they can argue. I believe straight away that these two men know each other. And even when Kirk comes back with quite a blunt response when McCoy is describing how what he saw was Nancy as she appeared as he last knew her. And Kirk is, I don't want to know how your love affects your vision. One of my men is dead. Oh. We get a bit of an odd scene on the bridge then. One, I did like that he's having coffee on the bridge, which is, I talked recently in an episode of Strange New Worlds how I like that sort of lived-in feel that they were eating during a briefing, and later on we see Kirk eating on the bridge as well. It just makes it feel a bit more real. But they get a communique from another officer, and Kirk says, tell Jose he'll get his chili peppers, I handpicked them myself, they're authentic Mexican. Okay, interesting inclusion in the episode there. Down in the dispensary, McCoy has discovered that there is no sodium chloride left in Darnell's blood system. All of the salt is gone. Kirk then says something quite odd. It's like, there isn't a mark on this man's body. There's literally rings all over his face, Kirk. Down. But what I do like, and an up, is to how they make peace straight away. McCoy and Kirk, they clear the air. That is... They decide that they need to go back down to the planet, so they ask Spock to assemble a landing party with some spares. I'm sorry, there's really no other way of describing. You know, a bit like earlier on, we're going to send Kirk and McCoy and Ensign Ricky. They kind of do it again here. They send Sturgeon and Green, and you might as well just put a target on their chest. But again, no red shirts. We get a sort of an explanation as to why salt is so important to the Craters, or at least why they want them to believe it is because in dry, arid conditions, salt is supposed to help in this situation. Robert Crater explains that when they arrived, they had 25 pounds of salt, and now they're down to a tiny amount. Well, salt shouldn't be too much of an issue, especially if someone keeps going around killing all the crewmen. Green and Sturgeon are already dead outside. I feel kind of good though for Green's performer, because at least he gets something to do in this episode. When we see that it's Nancy Crater, I don't think anyone is particularly surprised that Nancy Crater is the one seemingly killing people. We then see Nancy shapeshift and become Crewman Green. So nice for his performer, not so nice for the landing party. Professor Crater has no interest in coming up to the ship, and in fact he scarpers off. We get another sort of a strange, after McCoy and Kirk had just made peace, he says something to McCoy about, "You could learn something from Mr. Spock. Stop thinking with your glands." All right, listen, you made the point already. Down. Kirk orders for himself, McCoy and Green to beam up to the Enterprise. And so this is where something where foreknowledge plays in. That transporter would have absolutely picked up the fact that Green isn't human. In fact, there's an entire section after this where they scan the planet for life signs, and they're able to, you know, they make a whole song and dance about how they can, with pinpoint accuracy, they can really home in on the, you know, on life signs. To be fair, I will say that they can pick up life signs, but maybe at this point in Star Trek, they were less definite in the type of life sign that they pick up, you know, like as opposed to human, Vulcan, Andorian, so on and so forth. I suppose actually if we pick at that thread, the whole journey to Babel just falls apart. There is a nice moment though where they beam up and Kirk immediately speaks to the transporter tech about Sturgeon's body, which is down on the planet. And the transporter tech says, "Don't worry, sir, we'll bring him home." Up. There's actually a great shot after that where Kirk walks into the turbo lift and the camera follows him in. There's nothing to it. I quite like that it was a handheld camera doing that scene. Janice Rand appears. Oh, I am a Rand fan, a Rand stan, if you will. Green really nearly tips his hand in this one. He is full on creepazoid. He is obsessed by the fact that there is salt on the plate that Rand is holding. She walks into a turbo lift and he dives in after her. It's weird. Yeah, he really shows his hand. She then heads down towards the Arboretum where she's bringing Sulu, nice to see Sulu, his lunch, and Green ends up following them in. There is a few great moments in this scene, and in fact, funnily enough, this was one of Grace Lee Whitney's favourite scenes to film in Star Trek. Having this arboretum here, there is, you know, all different types of plants and flowers, and there's Beauregard, who is clearly a guy wearing a puppet, which is fantastic as well. I really enjoyed that. But then, yeah, you have Sulu is sitting there introduced as a botanist, which I really enjoy. Sulu did appear in Where No Man Has Gone Before, wearing blue, I might add, but he's here in his gold from this episode on. He also says to her, "May the great bird of the galaxy bless you," which these are some things I didn't realize were there as early as this. That one I really enjoyed. What I didn't enjoy is how creepy Green is. In he walks. Dude, could you be more obvious if you tried? Rand notices how odd Green is acting. It even says, "Have you been sipping at the Saurian brandy?" It's also a slightly funny thing is that Green's uniform clearly wasn't made for him. It is enormous on him. The actor was obviously a little bit smaller than whomever this was made for. There's also a funny thing, if you look at the one that Sulu is wearing, the actual delta that's on his uniform is quite a bit lower than where you would normally expect to find it. What this all tells me is that Star Trek was in its early days and it was still figuring things out. We get a very cool scene then where Uhura is confronted, if you like, by this shape-shifting creature who then takes the form of a crewman. She feels, or the creature feels Uhura was thinking of, this man who would attract her. They speak Swahili to each other. Again, love that these things are there so early from the beginning. This is clearly a sort of hypnosis is going on, which also helps to explain why the creature is able to kill so many crewmen. They're able to distract them, to hold them in this hypnosis. It works for me. And I'm also very glad that it didn't get Uhura. It very nearly does. The hands are going up, the fingers are going to either side of her face, but she's called away, and away she goes to the bridge, her life being saved by her duties. Fun fact about this episode, it's the only time we spend any time in McCoy's quarters. Yeah, I was surprised to actually learn that, but yes, it's the only time we visit his quarters in the original series. And there's also a lot of talk about drugs. McCoy badly needs sleep because he has been working himself to the bone and he is run down. So, effectively, Kirk says, take those red pills we talked about. I don't think we're talking about red pilling at this stage. Maybe. God, I hope not. Nancy Crater then appears at McCoy's quarters. And McCoy's like, oh, wow, Jim forgot to tell me that, he'd found you. Now, McCoy, there's being excited to see your ex again, and there's forgetting the basic ways starships are run. On the bridge, Spock is able to identify that Crater is the only one still on the planet, which means something may have beamed up to the ship with them. In McCoy's quarters, Nancy again nearly tips her hand by saying she feels safest around McCoy because McCoy has the strongest memories of her. At this point, those magic red pills that McCoy took start to take effect, and the creature takes on the appearance of McCoy. There's actually quite a cool shot where it pans from McCoy on the bed across to McCoy standing by the doorway as well. And again, remember 1966, that was impressive. Down on the planet, Kirk is starting to twig what's going on here. He pulls out his communicator. Great to see. Remember, flipping it, that's the best part. And he orders General Quarters 3. And we get some stock footage from where No Man Has Gone Before were used on the Enterprise. And you can tell that because of the type of uniforms that they're wearing. Robert Crater at this point is sort of mask off. He is standing there armed with the Mark II laser pistol, which I quite like that laser pistol. I'm a fan of a phaser, but I do like the laser pistol. And he is starting to, well, he doesn't want Kirk and Spock asking too many questions. He's not going to get his wish. Spock asks a, I guess, quite logical question. Still odd for Spock to say this. Why risk your life for his, he asks Kirk. And Kirk says, he's not trying to hurt us, he's trying to frighten us, and he's doing a good job at it. Up, by the way. William Shatner does a sort of a little zigzaggy run here in the next scene where he's trying to dodge being seen by Crater. And honestly, it's a little bit hilarious with his army crawl as well, but it is an up from me. It was quite fun to watch this. They do manage to outmaneuver and stun Crater with a sound that's only ever used in this episode. So the sound of the phaser is the same, but the sound of Crater being hit is only used in this episode. And the way he then speaks in this sort of a sluggish, slower style of speech as well. It's something that I maybe understand for pacing reasons they didn't use again, but I thought it quite worked here. But this is when we start to learn about the salt vampire as it has become known outside of the episode. It's never actually said in the episode salt vampire, but the M113 creature. Crater likens it to the buffalo of Earth, who used to be so numerous their herds would cover 3 states, and now they are gone. And this is what happened to the M113 creatures. They used to number in the millions, and now the last one left alive is currently aboard the Enterprise. Spock picks up that Crater always speaks about Nancy in the past tense, and he reveals that yes, about a year or 2 prior, the last of these creatures killed Nancy. But there's no anger and no hatred because, as Crater says, it was just a creature trying to survive. Up. This is something that Star Trek does very well. It's that understanding of science over emotion, and as tragic as it is that Nancy was killed, there is still the understanding that it wasn't anything done with malice. There was no anger, no pointed rage. It was simply survival. Kirk does counter with, it has the right to live, but does it have the right to kill? It's very Star Trek. And right there in that first episode is the big existential questions, which is why this entire discussion about the creature is my Latinum Up of the week. There's a briefing on the ship once they bring Crater up, and McCoy, who is of course the creature in disguise, sits there and argues that there is no trickery needed. You know, they talk about leaving caches of salt out as bait for this creature, but McCoy's like, why not just give it the salt? And it's interesting as well because there's no overt, it doesn't try to attack them. It doesn't try to run away even. It tries to argue just for surviving. And here as well, Crater reveals that he would recognize the creature even in disguise, which means Crater knows the whole time that he's sitting beside the creature. It's an interesting way to play this as well. Two people at this table are fully aware of the facts, while the two other people, Kirk and Spock, are trying to figure everything out, and they are several steps behind. Spock then jumps immediately to human rights violations and says, hey, how about some truth serum? So McCoy, Spock and Crater go off to the dispensary. The next thing you hear, Spock's been attacked, Crater is dead, and McCoy is nowhere to be found. Spock is saved by his Vulcan blood. It doesn't have the same salt deposits as human blood does. Sadly, Crater has now fallen victim to this starving animal, because that's what it is. It's never really clear if Crater sacrificed himself to the creature or if the creature attacked out of fear and desperation. It's sort of alluded to that it's the latter, but I believe it was probably closer to the former because Crater had worked so hard to protect the creature so far. We arrive then in McCoy's quarters where the creature, posing as Nancy again, comes in and is begging McCoy to save her. Kirk arrives and she quickly hypnotizes Kirk and begins to try and feed from Kirk. Spock arrives and straight away does his double punch against Nancy, and I'm sorry, but it is a bit silly. It's a down for me. And also the complete and utter overt shows of emotion here. Look, McCoy, he's trying to kill the captain. Oh my God! Ah, by the moons! It's a bit much. They would settle on what Spock would be as time went on. This is very much a holdover, I think, from the Cage version of Spock. McCoy is really struggling. He can't bring himself to fire on Nancy. Nancy then transforms. She begins to try and drink the salt from Kirk's blood. Kirk screams. None of the others did. Not sure what the story is there, but McCoy does fire. And he fires again, because at the end of the day, he knows it's not Nancy. And he is able to save his captain and his crew by sadly killing the last of this creature's kind. It's a bit heartrending to watch because Nancy tries to beg. She says, Leonard, no, Leonard, no. And he says, Lord, forgive me, as he fires. Yeah, for a non-denominational Star Trek future, by the way, there's an awful lot of talk about God, particularly from McCoy. It is quite funny because people talk about, oh, there's no religion in the future. Well, yes, there is. Kirk, seeing what McCoy has had to go through, says, I'm sorry, Bones. Up. The episode closes with Kirk in the captain's chair, lost in thought. Spock says, what were you thinking of, Captain? And he goes, I was thinking of the buffalo, Mr. Spock. We then get a great scene, in the remastered edition at least, where Sulu is ordered to go to Warp 1 and we get a reverse shot which includes the nacelles of the Enterprise warping away from planet M113. Yeah, I like it. Up. Just before we jump to temporal observations, this being the first televised episode of Star Trek, the end credits are actually a little bit different. Normally, when we think of the end credits of the original series, we think of that great puppet of Baylock, but he's completely absent from these end credits because they use footage that was filmed for The Cage and for Where No Man Has Gone Before, which I just thought was quite interesting, really. Now, will you join me please at temporal observations? I'm not gonna lie, I like this one. For our temporal observations, obviously so much relies on this episode. So it's really interesting to know that contemporary reviews of The Man Trap were not kind. Some accused it of being little more than B-movie fare, which I think is a little bit unfair, and also, why must B-movies be called something bad? Others said that it was an awful show, some of the worst they'd ever done. That one being William Shatner in his book Star Trek Memories. Leonard Nimoy also said that of the episodes they had done to that point, this was not the favourite one that they had done. In fact, The Man Trap was picked to go first because it was a relatively straightforward episode, and it was one that it had horror elements, it had good sci-fi elements, but really, when you get right down to it, it's because it was ready. Other episodes, like Mud's Women, for example, they didn't want to open with the idea of buying and selling women. And then other ideas just hadn't been quite fleshed out enough. Did you know that, in fact, an idea that would eventually go on to be a piece of the action was touted as one of the early episodes as well? The Corbomite maneuver was also offered as an option for the pilot episode before they went with The Man Trap. The Salt Vampire has become a little bit of a legendary status in Star Trek. The actual outfit that it's made of, which was designed by Hua Chang, who was the props designer who would design such things as, you know, the Klingon battlecruiser and the Romulan bird of prey, he based the Salt Vampire's mouth around a gas mask. This costume would appear again in the episode The Squire of Gothos, where it's mounted against a wall. In fact, if you watch that episode closely, you can see that McCoy has a reaction when he sees that, even though they don't discuss it in the episode. The Star Trek short trek Ephraim and Dot shows the Salt Vampire again, and one would appear trying to drink Ransom's blood in Star Trek Lower Decks, and I don't really know how that works if the last one died aboard the Enterprise. That doesn't mean I'm not happy to see that a species makes a bounce back. Star Trek's all about species making a bounce back. Hello, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. There was a redesigned version of the Salt Vampire that was going to be used in Star Trek 2009. Which is really interesting when you think that they had that Spock-Uhura flirtation going on in The Man Trap here, and of course in Star Trek 09, Spock and Uhura are a full couple. Now, that was actually not included in the final cut of the film. There was also a redesigned version of the Gorn. They were both going to be shown on Rora Penthe, whereas that whole sequence was cut from the film. We get things like the death of crewmen even though they're not in red shirts, which is quite worrying, really. Is nobody safe? Those reuses of uniforms via stock footage from Where No Man Has Gone Before. This is also the first, well, it's obviously the first time Uhura wears red. It's the first episode that was on television. But also, she had worn gold in both Where No Man Has Gone Before and the Corbomite maneuver, both of which, of course, produced earlier than The Man Trap. In that exchange between Uhura and Spock, there's something very interesting, which is the revelation that Vulcan has no moon. Well, that's something that they would run with, because in the animated series episode Yesteryear, there is very clearly something in the sky over Vulcan. We recently did a list about strangest worlds in Star Trek, and one of them is Tikhut. So T''Khut, which, a bit like Pluto and Charon in our own solar system, DC Fontana described as a sister planet to Vulcan. So it's a way of getting around the fact that there was no moon. That, in fact, was confirmed in Star Trek Strange New Worlds. It is on a panel in the episode Charades. For this whole episode, sickbay is not mentioned once. It's called the dispensary. I mentioned earlier that this episode, you kind of struggle a little bit when you compare it to, technology that we've now seen to be quite standard in Star Trek. Like, the transporter would have absolutely picked up the fact that green was not the same transporter pattern that they had beamed down before. It was a totally different creature altogether. So it's one of those things where you go back and you watch some of the original series, and we have since learned things about Star Trek and Star Trek technology that don't marry up with how they were presented back then. It's just part of an expanding franchise. For example, the presentation here that Uhura and Spock are sort of getting to know each other a little bit, despite, thanks to Strange New Worlds, learning that they've been serving together for about 7 years at this point. May the great bird of the galaxy bless you. That was Gene Roddenberry's nickname. The Great Bird of the Galaxy would appear on screen in the Next Generation episode, The Naked Now, as an interesting depiction. But yes, that was Gene's nickname. Those coloured cubes of food appear here, right in this first episode. I've really enjoyed going back and watching The Man Trap, just to see what ingredients are there from day one. The inclusion of Uhura speaking Swahili in this first episode, because the name Uhura itself is from the Swahili language. The red and gold material that all of the beds seem to be made of as well, making its debut here in our only visit to McCoy's quarters. The laser pistol that Crater uses, as opposed to phaser, is an updated that was used in Where No Man Has Gone Before. So the very first version, the Mark I, was around in the Cage. It was standard weaponry for the Starfleet officers in that episode. It had been updated slightly for Where No Man Has Gone Before, and that's the version that Crater is using, where the standard phasers that we would go on to see in most episodes of the original series are used by Kirk and Spock. We get the first early use of the double punch, which is just become just an iconic piece of Star Trek, with Spock doing his very best to knock out the creature posing as Nancy Crater. And of course, the design of the M113 creature is an iconic image in all of Star Trek. It's one of those ones where it's so bled into popular culture that I think even non-Star Trek fans would probably recognize the image. It's quite interesting, actually. The novelization of this episode that was written by James Blish actually called it The Unreal McCoy as opposed to The Man Trap. And Robert and Nancy were surnamed Bierce instead of Crater. So obviously he'd been working off an earlier script for it as well. It's just really interesting how these things work out. This is an episode that has, for several reasons, gone on to be iconic. As I say, contemporary reviews were not kind. Actually, I really enjoy it. I think all of the ingredients for Star Trek are here. It's a really good McCoy episode. It's got good stuff with Spock, Sulu, Rand, as I say, always great to see Rand, and of course Kirk as well. It is also one of 3 potentials when we talk about the pilots of the original series. Now, we will cover Where No Man Has Gone Before, and we will cover The Cage as well. But not next week, because next week we're going to jump ahead to 1987, when people were wearing too tight spandex, one-piece outfits, and they were introduced to a little person named Q. But until then, you look after yourselves. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching along. You are awesome. You are wonderful. Subscribing is what allows us to make videos like this. So please, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It makes a massive, massive difference. Please make sure that you are liking and sharing as well. Make sure that you're following us on the various socials. I am at Sean Ferrick, but more importantly, at TrekCulture on all of the socials, at TrekCulture YT. We're on Facebook as well. If you're on Facebook, make sure that you're giving us a follow there. And thank you to Eddie, who edited this to look as gorgeous as it looks now. Eddie, you're a legend. Everyone, until I see you again, live long and prosper, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, put peace out into the world. To our friends in Sudan, Congo, and Palestine, we love you. We are only hoping for peace and an end to hostilities. That is, I think, what we should all be aiming towards. Folks, see you soon. Thanks very much.